Thank you all for being here today to ensure that everyone in America hears about the problem of driver's license suspensions and does something about it. Good afternoon. I'm Lisa Foster, co-director with Joanna Weiss of the Fines and Fees Justice Center. Free to Drive is a nationwide campaign to change the rules of the road across America. 115 organizations from across the country are committing to a sound and simple policy. Driver's licenses should not be used to coerce fines, fees, or debt payment, or a court appearance. They should only be suspended for public safety. Driver's license suspensions are counterproductive, cruel, and costly. They're counterproductive because people who can't afford to immediately pay exorbitant fines and fees don't suddenly find money in their pocket. To the contrary, it just makes it harder for people to get to work or keep their job. Indeed, half the people who lose their driver's licenses lose their jobs, and that job loss is felt by the individual, their family, and the entire community. As steering committee member Koch Industries wrote in yesterday's Wall Street Journal, businesses in the United States depend on employees reliably getting to work. For 85% of Americans, that means driving. And many jobs, and many good jobs, require driving as a part of the job. That makes it especially hard for people reentering their communities after a period of incarceration, who already have a tough time getting decent work. And importantly, we know driver's license suspensions don't work. Data from the states where we get it shows that once their license is suspended, many people stay suspended for years. Suspending licenses doesn't increase collections at all. Driver's license suspensions are cruel because without a license, virtually every aspect of a person's life and the life of their family is adversely impacted. People can't reliably take their children to school, take a family member to the doctor, get themselves to a court appearance, religious services, or the grocery store. And driver's license suspensions are costly. They undermine public safety, and we waste public resources by stopping, citing, and prosecuting people for driving on a suspended license. Resources that could be better spent attending to serious crime. Suspensions do not affect all Americans equally. Not surprisingly, people living in poverty or working low-wage jobs can't afford to pay fines and fees that most states impose for everything from toll violations to speeding tickets to drug trafficking. They're punished harshly for their poverty. First, if they don't pay on time, the amount they owe increases, late fees or interest attaches. And second, they're punished again when their license is suspended. Largely because of over-policing in their communities, and also because they are more likely to live in poverty, Black and Latinx people suffer license suspensions at higher rates than white people. And they disproportionately suffer the consequences of driving on a suspended license. In New York City, 75% of drivers are white, 87% of people charged for driving on a suspended license are not white. You may have noticed something else in the video you just saw. Celeste, a Black woman, went to jail when she was cited for driving on a suspended license, while Kevin, a white college student, didn't. Those are true stories. Suspensions also disproportionately affect children. They suffer when a parent loses their job because they can't drive, when they have to rely on inadequate public transportation to get to school, when they miss a medical appointment because they don't have dependable transportation. And they suffer when they can't get a driver's license of their own when they come of age. They may have gotten a jaywalking ticket or been justice system involved as a child. And of course, the government assesses fines and fees against children as well as adults. Our first panel this afternoon is going to talk more about how profoundly harmful driver's license suspensions policies are around the country. Our second panel is going to talk about how to reform those policies. They're going to talk about what's worked and what hasn't. If you don't know about the problem of driver's license suspensions before you came here today, I assure you, you will when you leave.
First off, thank you so much, Desiree, for sharing your story, not only with everyone in the room, but with everyone who's going to see this video from here on out. I know this is a very personal experience for you, a very traumatic experience, but your willingness to advocate and share your story is going to make a lot of lives better. So thank you. Desiree, unlike many of the people here today, the practice of driver's license suspension for not being able to pay your court debt has directly impacted your life. Well, we're going to hear how some of this came to be and what impacts were that were in your life from that video. Can you tell us the impacts of your day-to-day life as a result of driver's license suspension?
First, I want to say thank you for having me. My day-to-day life is, I don't want to say horrible because it's not horrible, but it changed dramatically. Like, I can't drive to get to work. I can't drive to take my daughter to Girl Scouts or do just the normal average things that you guys do. It makes you feel like you're less than a adult, like you're still a child asking your mom to take you or getting Ubers or public transportation to get to anywhere you have to be.
At one point, you were planning to go to nursing school, is that right?
Yes.
Can you tell us what happened to your pursuit of nursing school as a result of your license being suspended?
Well, when I was arrested, I actually missed the deadline, and then after being arrested and finding out my license is suspended, I had to just find other ways. I couldn't do nursing school because I can't take the test because my license is suspended. You have to have a valid license for, I think, 3 years or something like that. So I had to go another route.
Whatever other things have you been trying to do since that time?
Since then, I've recently got into hair school, so I'm doing hair. And I started a nonprofit for diabetes because you don't have to have a license to actually start a nonprofit. So I started a nonprofit to, and I'll go around and basically just educate the communities, different communities on how to figure out if you have diabetes, how to maintain diabetes, how to live with it on a day-to-day basis.
So one thing that was touched on in the video was that your diabetes requires active medical management, and that when you were incarcerated, that was the type of medical care that you were not able to receive while you were in custody. How is your access to health care currently impacted, and what sort of medical care have you had to go through as a result of using your driver's license?
It was impacted dramatically. Like, I went maybe 2 weeks, 3, almost 3 weeks without medicine, period, before I was able to take insulin. So my sugars were going high. Then when I wouldn't eat, they would go low. They weren't feeding me. I didn't eat properly. And sometimes I didn't eat because I couldn't eat what they were serving. So once I got out, I was in Dr. S's office almost like every day, calling her, emailing her, like, I'm sick. I did a few hospital stays for like a week at a time after I got out because my sugar was just everywhere. Like, so it's been a journey getting it back, but I think we got it under control a little bit as of right now. So it's been hard.
Is there anything you'd like to share with the audience today, or anyone who may hear you speaking about the issue of driver's license suspension and how it has impacted your life?
If you got your license, just take care of it, keep it, don't speed. But I really honestly feel like for certain tickets, like traffic violations, it's blasphemy. Why are you gonna suspend someone or put someone in jail who is doing no crime whatsoever? Like, speeding, I get it, but to have me or anyone like me go to jail for 2 weeks at a time because they have a traffic violation is just ridiculous.
Desiree, thank you again for sharing this deeply personal part of your life with us here today. It's greatly appreciated.
Thank you.
So now we'll move on. Yes, definitely. So now we'll move on to Dr. Mahala Schlagman. So Dr. Schlagman is actually one of Desiree's doctors, and she'd be able to sort of speak to, as she did in the video, what that relationship was like when she had a patient who had been incarcerated for this issue. But also in the video, you talk a lot about these barriers to healthcare, and what would you sort of classify as the social determinants of health, and how does driver's license suspension play into the access to healthcare?
Thank you. And thank you to Desiree for doing this with me. I'm glad we could be here together. So the social determinants of health are the conditions under which we're born, grow, live, work, and play. And if you think about it, you probably spend maybe a few hours a year in the doctor's office, but you'll spend hundreds, thousands, millions of hours in your house, outside, going to school, and all of these things are really much more determining of our health than actually what you do in the doctor's office with me or another doctor. In fact, they're about an estimated 80% of health. And then 10% of health is access to medical care, and another 10% is what I do, which is providing medical care. What Desiree has experienced directly impacted her health. For a hugely unfortunate example, when she was incarcerated, they didn't believe her that she had diabetes initially. And so she didn't receive insulin, and then eventually she received too much insulin because of the complications of how difficult her diabetes is to control. And so she had basically a near-death experience, unfortunately, while incarcerated, where her sugars went very low. Now, this can happen out in the community, but the difference is that you have access to food out in the community, and people, don't have to give you their last orange juice in order to be able to survive. This is not something that is a positive experience for health. And when Desiree came back to my office, she was sick in a number of ways, but this was one of them.
Rochester, where you are, and where Desiree lives, has a zip code with the highest traffic debt suspension rate in the state of New York. I believe that is more than one suspension for every 3 people of driving age. That zip code is 14611, where Desiree actually lives. Driving on a suspended license is also one of the most common charges in the state of New York. How does this impact your patients and their access to health care?
So I see this all the time. How people are impacted by the inability to access transportation, the inability to access food, things that often some of us don't have to think about on a regular basis. So if you take a look, for example, at 14611, there are about 5,000 jobs approximately that you can get to in 20 minutes if you have a car. But there are about 270,000 jobs that you can get to within 20 minutes when you have, so if you take the bus, you have 5,000 jobs. If you take a car, you can get to 270,000 jobs. And the ability to work is a significant impact on people's long-term health outcomes. If you're able to work, you're able to access health insurance, you're able to afford your medications, you're able to afford better food. And so ultimately, having that resource of having a driver's license, being able to take a car to work, being able to take a car to my office will have a significant impact on health. If you take a look, so there are no studies that specifically look at driver's license suspensions, but there is one really interesting study that was done a few years ago and took a look at transportation for patients to medical offices, non-emergency medical transportation it's called. And when you look at that study, they actually did a cost analysis on whether or not it's worth giving people basically free transportation to the office. And they calculated that for things like diabetes, for example, there's actually a cost savings to the system by giving them free transportation. And the reason is that when you treat somebody's diabetes early up front, you help them have better long-term health outcomes. You prevent the complications of diabetes that ultimately kill people and cost the system a lot more money as well. And so you can take that data and suggest that giving somebody access to transportation by giving them a license might also potentially allow them to access medical care in a way that would be a cost savings to the system.
So Desiree has shared her story, and in so many ways that was traumatic and it was difficult. Do you think, based on your experience of care, that this is something that's been unique to Desiree, or this has more far-reaching implications? And if so, how did we get here?
Yeah, so this is not unique to Desiree, as you've spoken about. The patients that I care for come from many different backgrounds, but many of our patients don't have access to transportation, and that can be a significant barrier to getting to the medical office. One of the things that I think about is historically how we got to be this way. And one of the things about Rochester is that it's similar to a lot of mid-sized cities. I can specifically speak to Rochester. One of the things that happened was that in the 1930s, 40s, 20s, a lot of the neighborhoods, like the neighborhood where Desiree lived, for example, were redlined. And so people of color were unable, and Jews for that matter, were unable to live in certain parts of the community. What happened was that ultimately the middle class tended to move out towards the suburbs as we moved towards the 60s and 70s. And what was left was basically an urban core where people didn't have access to transportation. Now, part of the reason that people didn't have access to transportation in Rochester was that a lot of government funding went to road building. And that wasn't just in Rochester, it was actually a national phenomenon. And so at one point, one senator suggested that we were putting about 1% of our transportation budget for the total United States into public transportation. And Rochester is very similar to many mid-sized cities in that the public transportation is lousy. So for somebody like Desiree, it'll take an hour to get to my office on the bus. I think I clocked it at like an hour and 30 minutes at one point in the winter. So that significantly contributes to the barrier to accessing medical care. If you have to come twice a week and it takes you an hour and a half to get there, and then you also want to have a job and you're trying to treat your diabetes, it's not really humanly possible.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schlagman, for giving us this really unique but very helpful perspective on healthcare and how driver's license suspension can really prohibit access to it. So this transportation piece is a great segue to our next speaker, Malcom. Malcom is passionate about how public policy and technology can improve people's lives, especially in areas of transportation, economic development, housing, education, and public health, and particularly how access to technology can create opportunities for people from traditionally underserved communities. Given your passion, how do you see the issue of debt-related suspensions as a barrier to employment and opportunities, both at Uber, but for businesses in general?
Yeah, well, first off, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Priya. Thank you, Dr. Schlagman and Desiree, for sharing your story. You all have lived this, and I'm just sort of speaking in the small way that we've played a small part in understanding how this phenomenon is so disadvantageous for so many communities around the country. And I appreciate that you all talked about transportation because, of course, that's something we think a lot about at Uber is how transportation affects outcomes, both from a health perspective, from a wellness perspective more generally. I'm actually not going to talk about transportation today, though. I'm just going to talk about the work perspective because transportation is our platform, but that is facilitated by a bunch of people who are driving in cars. And so the implications for our platform are quite significant. Of course, the vast majority of the people who are driving with Uber and around the world, you're talking well over 3 million people, probably about a quarter of that in the United States. These people are all driving cars to make money. That is their way of making money on the platform, with a couple of exceptions. Now there are parts of the business where people can use bicycles, and in really dense areas, people can deliver food by walking. But for the most part, almost everyone who makes money on our platform is driving. And of course, that requires a driver's license to do so. And so when we think about how we evaluate whether someone is going to be a good driver on our platform, we really think about the public safety question that Lisa mentioned, and or a question of whether they are going to be a safe driver. And we do not think about these minor traffic violations when we think about safety. And so we really want to balance, is this person going to be safe for the rider, and are we creating a fair process for folks to drive? And if the answer is yes, these people are going to be safe, then why not let them drive? The notion that we're going to have a debt-related suspension, which has no bearing on whether someone is going to drive a person or a thing safely from point A to point B, the notion that we're going to hold that over someone's head when the debt is, when the opportunity to drive is the way they would actually pay back that debt is completely nonsensical. And so there's a business imperative for us to be supportive of this, as well as a moral one, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And I think, one of the things that's really valuable for our platform is it's completely flexible. So we're not talking about people who have to drive shifts. We're not talking about people who necessarily have to be beholden to a schedule that doesn't work with their lives. You can drive with Uber whenever you want. And if someone takes away your driver's license, it doesn't only take away necessarily the job, the work opportunity, but it takes away the flexibility that comes with that work opportunity. And the collateral consequences of having that driver's license takes away, restricts your time, increases the cost of transportation, increases the cost of getting work in the first place, which of course has all of these other nefarious consequences that people have spoken to today. And so I think we recognize that when you think about the greatest determining factors, especially when you talk about folks who have been justice involved, it's access to work and it's access to housing. And so if we are going to allow a system to put in place barriers that make doing those things harder, the collateral consequences are going to be greater, the nefarious impacts on communities are going to be greater. And so we want to be thoughtful in the way that we can with our own process about making sure those barriers aren't in place. And when it makes sense, lending our voice to the conversation and letting folks know, hey, this is not going to be good for us, but it's also not going to be good for your broader community either.
Malcolm, from a business perspective, what got Uber interested in working on these issues and criminal justice in general?
I think we really kind of stumbled into this space. This is not an area where we set out to be really involved or, quite frankly, be out in front of a lot of these policy issues, but we did a couple of things that made us realize there was a lot more that we could do. So I've been at Uber for about 4 years now, and I focus largely on issues from a policy perspective related to access in underserved communities. And when I started at the company about 4 years ago, we started to really have some interesting conversations with issue groups and advocacy organizations and nonprofits, particularly in California where we're headquartered, about whether our policies were making sense, particularly for marginalized communities. And one of the things that became very clear to us very quickly was that perhaps we had some criteria in our background screening process that was not fair, that didn't make sense for the question of whether someone was going to safely drive someone from point A to point B. And so this was about a year after the passage of Proposition 47 in California, and Prop 47 in California reclassified a number of offenses from felonies to misdemeanors. And so through a whole host of internal conversations back and forth, we basically realigned our driver screening process around Prop 47. So we said if they're going to not disqualify people, if they're going to reclassify for a bunch of these offenses, these probably don't make sense for us to disqualify you from getting an opportunity to make money on our platform. We did that as a bit of an experiment in response to a lot of feedback we got from some really thoughtful advocates. And then from there, we realized that there was a lot of appetite to engage businesses around this space. And so the first thing we did is we were invited to be one of the inaugural signers of the Obama White House Fair Chance Business Pledge. And through those conversations and similar ones, we realized that a lot of other businesses were both involved in this space, but perhaps they just banned the box and wanted to go a little bit further in the justice conversation. But they said, I can't make the argument internally to leadership as to why this is going to be good from a business perspective. It's unquestionable that it's the right thing to do, but how can I make this argument that this is going to be a good ROI, return on investment? So we said, well, this isn't a perfect answer to that question, but all of our drivers get a rating after every ride. And so what if we look at the ratings for the folks under the new criteria, the fairer, more lenient criteria, and the folks under the old criteria? And what we found was that there was no statistical difference between the ratings for the folks under the new criteria versus the old criteria. In fact, folks under the new criteria had marginally higher ratings, were actually driving more frequently on the platform. And so we started to really tell the story of, hey, there's data that shows that this is, again, of course, the right thing to do, but the way that you're actually going to get people from a business perspective involved just show that there's a value proposition for the bottom line. And so it's been good for our business. It's been great for the people who have taken advantage of this opportunity who maybe otherwise wouldn't have been able to work. We have a website, uber.com/CJR, where we've highlighted some of the stories of people who said, I wasn't able to get work, and as a result of these changes, I was able to work and make money, and in some cases, provide for my family. And so we did not intend, as I mentioned, to be involved in this space, but we recognize that we have a really valuable role to play, particularly as a big company, involved in the justice conversation, in letting other folks know that make sure you're doing what's right, but find out a way that you can also make a value proposition to the rest of your business, because ultimately I think that's what really gets people involved from a company perspective. And if we have people doing those things, even if it's for a bottom line reason, but it ultimately results in a better outcome for people involved, I think that's a win-win all around.
Thank you, Malcolm. That is a really helpful perspective, especially as we're thinking about building our coalition and bringing more business folks into the fold on why driver's license suspension matters and why it should matter to them. So thank you very much. So now moving on, John is our next speaker today, and John works with the public and private sector to build partnerships designed to lead better employment outcomes and safer communities. His experience on both sides of the criminal and legal system gives him a unique perspective on both the construction of policy, but also the implications of those policies. We're happy to have him today to discuss death-based driver's license suspensions. John, tell us how you got involved with the driver's license suspension issue and what that original work looked like in New Jersey.
Sure. And thank you, Priya, for putting this together. And Desiree, thank you for sharing your lived experience. That really brings the issue home, I think, for so many of us. The project I work on primarily is called the Safe Streets and Second Chances Project, which is a research-informed policy project with Florida State University, Right on Crime, the Stand Together community, and Koch Industries. And we have researchers in 50-something prisons right now, going up to 90 in about 3 months. And the universal finding in every state we're in is that transportation is the #1 barrier for this population. This is on-the-ground research happening every day in our prison system for inmates leaving. The next round, we asked the researchers to look at what that is, why that is, And part of it had to do with, as a doctor said, that the transportation's lousy almost everywhere. And then a massive part of it has to do with all these folks suspended for fines and fees. So I have sort of an ironic story about fines and about a license suspension. After a career in New Jersey, representing, people accused of murder and racketeering, wiretap cases and gang cases, I would go to prison myself. I drove drunk, I hit somebody, thank God I didn't kill them, and I tried to lie my way out of it. And that was the end of my battle with alcoholism and the beginning of my recovery. And thank the Lord that person lived. So you would think my license would have been suspended for that. But due to an anomaly in my plea agreement, it was not. Even though I was very openly admitted driving drunk, openly admitted hitting someone, and openly admitted lying my way out of it, I still had to drive. My license is clean. It was the only thing I got left that's clean, but hey, at least I got something. In any event, my license did get suspended when I was in prison. It hit me that here I am with a guy with limitless access to the legal system, and this was happening to me. And simultaneously, I'm watching people go to halfway houses and get sent right back. Some of these people have significant challenges educationally and otherwise. So what chance do they have? So I'm sitting in prison. I started really thinking about this issue. And I get out, I parole out, and when I practiced, I was lead counsel of the NAACP in Central Jersey, but I didn't have a law license, obviously. So I wanted to do something sort of good with my soul to advance my recovery. So I started volunteering at a prisoner reentry program in New Jersey, and I had a job, so I didn't need reentry services, but I said, listen, my old drinking buddies, my old lawyer friends are going to clear up licenses. I said, that's all we're going to do. We're going to clear up licenses and IDs for these guys. So it was good. Every Friday I'd go. We'd have sort of a peer recovery session. I'd assign them out to my buddies. That volunteer gig led to a meeting with Chris Christie that former Governor Jim McGreevey took me to, and we ended up building a very large reentry program. Throughout that reentry program, the #1 thing I worried about was IDs, fines, fees, and driver's licenses. Wherever I go around the country, especially New Jersey, having no driver's license is the #1 barrier to employment. However, with a driver's license, we were able to put returning citizens into jobs in the building trades, into jobs in other unions, and into good jobs, right? Jobs that climb the ladder of opportunity. Also think about it as an employer. employers would not work with my population beforehand if we didn't have this legal program, because they knew the guy would have to go to court 15 times to clear up these court dates. So no one's going to hire, no business can be expected to hire that. So what we did, we tried legislative action at first. In New Jersey, we got nowhere. So I ended up building out what would become the largest driver's license restoration program of its kind. We took 70 lawyers, connected them by a cloud-based case management system. We actually called it the poor man's Uber for lawyers, is what I called it. It was the only way people could conceptualize it. And the way it would work is we'd centralize filing, and if you were a lawyer, way down in Cape May or way out in Camden County, you typed your password in, got the documents in the case, and walked to your court right across the street. The net result was over 400 driver's licenses restored in the 3 years I was there, thousands of pieces of identification, and hundreds of thousands of fines cleared. Now, when you think about this, some people would say to me when I was doing this, well, John, they can go to the DMV themselves and clear it up, or at least find out what's wrong. It doesn't work that way. A, they can't get there. Let's assume they can get there. B, they don't have enough identity documentation to even show that they are who they are to get the document to tell them how to fix the problem. C, if nobody cleared up those old fines, fees, and warrants, they go to jail from the DMV. So no one's entering the DMV. So we realized that. So what we did was, the key component to the program was the Motor Vehicle Commission would give us the obligation reports, and then what we would do, we'd use our poor man's Uber for lawyers. We'd use our filing system. And then from there, immediate letters of representation would be generated and sent out. And what that did was that cleared all the bench warrants at the front end so someone can participate in the free world once again. Then from there, lawyers would go mitigate the fees. So this project while it was impressive, it served as a proof of concept. Chief Justice Rabner in New Jersey just wiped out like 800,000 old tickets that were causing these problems as a result of, or in part result of what we did. But it's not optimal. What's optimal is statutory change to end this process altogether. All we did was show proof of concept. But I can tell you, if you were to think of the irony that I had a driver's license, right? I think about that all the time, except for a failure to cut the lawn, right? I was the one on that video that shouldn't have had the driver's license, right? Until I had served a period of suspension, got clean, etc. So clearly the system is not punishing who it needs to punish. Because of my access in the court, my case was thrown out quite easily. Because I had resources, I was able to pay the $100 restoration fee. The fines and fee structure in this country reinforces poverty. It ties people up in technical violations that should have never existed, and serves as a barrier to us all. And what I mean by that is the more people can't get work because of issues as simple as this. The smaller our tax bases are, the more children go without working parents, and the more mothers like Desiree have to take their chances on the road every day to go get insulin or to take their daughter to an appointment or to do something else. It's completely foolish. And while I'm very proud of what we did in New Jersey before I came here to DC, I expect to see bigger things in different parts of the country. But what I hope to see is broad-based legislative change or broad-based administrative change led by our governors, led by our law enforcement leaders, who understand that it's a lot more important to lock somebody up for committing a crime than for not paying a fee.
Senator Stanley is a Republican Virginia State Senator who represents the 20th District of Virginia. He is also a key player in Virginia's recent and ongoing efforts to end driver's license suspensions for unpaid court debt. Thank you for being here today. Senator Stanley, tell us how a Republican from Virginia became the leading voice, one of the leading voices on driver's license suspension reform.
It can happen. I don't know, I wouldn't call myself a reform Republican or anything like that. I come from a very conservative area in Southside and Southwest Virginia. Used to be the top of the food chain in terms of economics. We built Virginia after some trade deals, NAFTA, CAFTA. All of our jobs in textile, tobacco manufacturing went overseas. And so what we've experienced is a lot of poverty. In fact, nearly 1 out of 3 children live at or below the poverty level in my district alone. And my district is the 3rd largest in terms of geographic size because we've had diminishing populations, higher unemployment, worse outcomes when it comes to high school graduation rates. And so those challenges were already there, and I practiced law with the Stanley Law Group, my firm, for 25 years with my mother. That's another story, but we won't talk about it here. And so what I saw in that practice, I do criminal defense among other things and civil litigation, a lot of large cases, but I took indigent cases in Franklin County as a favor to the judges. But what I found was over and over and over and over, usually there were people that were being charged with driving on suspended, and it was for no other reason than they had not paid their fines and court costs. In fact, there are 9 different sections in the Virginia Code which have suspension of licenses for non-payment of things. Not just your fines and court costs, other payments that can be, even water bills and things. You can lose your license in Virginia in 9 different ways. But every time I met one of my clients who I took on as an indigent client, it was because a fine had turned, a $25 fine had turned into thousands of dollars. And it wasn't bad driving behavior that caused them to lose their license. It was the inability to pay due to their financial circumstances of making a decision of whether to put food on the table or shoes on their children or to be able to pay that fine that month. And in Virginia, we had a very archaic process where the court could give you 30 days. But if you missed by a half a day, that payment, your license was suspended. If you were late, your license was suspended, and you were not given any notice of it. And so we also have in Virginia in the Commonwealth in our General District Court, because the General Assembly decides that we can't raise enough money in other ways, and so what we do is we pile court costs and other costs and fees on top of a fine. So if someone gets a $25 fine, they go into the clerk's office and they say, that'll be $190. It's over $100 for a $25 fine, believe it or not. And they say, well, wait a minute, it's a $25 fine, and they can't pay it. Hopefully I can pay it next month. Lose their license, have to get their jobs. In my areas, our deputy sheriffs, a lot more often than not, are familiar with our people. So they know who's suspended or not. Sometimes they're even waiting for them. And so, as I said, there was a large population who were being forced, who were financially being forced into more poverty because they could not get themselves out of the hole that the government had dug for them by creating debtor's prison. This was debtor's prison. I thought we got rid of that when we became an independent country based on Republic and Democrat principles. So what I decided for myself was, with the judge and the prosecutor saying, let's do it, let's try to get these people through this. And I was, the Senate job is a part-time gig, 60 days out of the year. But what we would do is continue these cases for a year, 18 months, to try to get them to where they could pay off their fines and get their licenses back. And then we would give them no OL and give them a fine. But it worked sometimes, but it didn't work a lot. So then the next process was, we've got to do something. So I created a piece of legislation. I've been fighting for this for 3 years, that would create a payment plan, a very easygoing payment plan, and would not send these to collections, because I was looking in the research, 45 days was about when people could start making payments. So we stretched that out to 90 days and allowed even a very generous payment plan. And so that was my first year fight, because I tried the repeal and everybody laughed at me. I said I wasn't law and order. So then the second year I got together with Amy Woolard, and I said, I've had enough. We're just going to go for straight repeal, because this was unfair to people. And it was hurting economically those people in my area the most, who were trying to put food on their table for the children. And people, when I put it through the first time, it gets killed in the Senate. Second time, we get out of the Senate. And Republicans would look at me and say, what are you doing? What are you, law and order-y? And I've got a reputation, because of being a criminal defense attorney, that I work on criminal justice reform issues in the Commonwealth of Virginia. But I simply said to them this: there is nothing more conservative than making sure that we get rid of debtor's prison, that we restore dignity to those who are in a financial situation that caused them to be unable to pay their fines, that we recognize that there is a property interest within that license once the privilege is given that cannot be denied without due process of law protected by the Constitution, and that we want people to not only be independent and have the chance of the American dream, but not be dependent on the government. And for those reasons, there is no more of a conservative basis for support of my law. So after I made that argument, I got it out of the Senate, and it died in the House. And I had to go make that argument again this year. And I said to Amy Willard, I am even more determined. We are going to do this, and we're going to do it. And it became a passion for me. And so what was, and believe me, Democrats had no problem supporting my bill. It was the ones that I had to convince that were the Republicans. So this year, we got it out 31. We'd increased almost to three-quarters margin. A bipartisan initiative, went over to the House. The year before, they had stuck it in a House Money Committee, and it never got a hearing. This year, they knew that I was determined that I was going to get this through. And they also knew that they had wide support on the House floor. So they stuck it in a committee called the Crim Sub B, which is run by two people, Republicans, law and order, who believe there is no way that you're being law and ordery if you don't make people pay their fines, and if they don't pay their fines, they get their license suspended. And I made my argument, and my own party killed my bill. Even friends of mine who walked up and said, I really wanted to vote for that. That burned me up. And so Amy, knowing that I'm a passionate guy and a little emotional about it, I went outside and I said some really awful things to the press about my fellow Republicans. And then Amy took me back, called me down to my office and said, there's another way we can do this. The governor left $9 million in the budget that would have paid the restoration fees. The House never took it out. Why don't you go over to your friend, Ralph Northam, and see if he'll put it in his budget amendments that will come back. And I looked at Amy and I said, you are a genius. And that's what I did. I went over and convinced our governor, and he said, do you think it'll work? Well, with AFP, Americans for Prosperity, ACLU, Poverty Law Center, all of the people working together, we knew we had the votes if we could just get it to the floor of the Senate. That two people killed a bill we knew would win by three-quarter votes in the House. And so when it came back over and we returned a month later after General Assembly regular session ended at the veto session, it passed even by bigger margins. And I'm surprised because it's an election year, so I'm sure everybody wanted to vote for it then, and then bigger margins, and is now law of the land of the Commonwealth of Virginia. But for 1 year, it only lasts as long as our budget. So what we have to do is pass it again next year. But I think with the results that we've had, 38,000 automatically restored like that, 19,000 already engaged in the process. And as I've said to my Republican brothers and sisters, the sky didn't fall, the sun still rose. And actually what we're doing is we're increasing the GDP of Virginia. Almost 1 million people can get their licenses back now by the work that Amy Willard, myself, and others work so hard to do.
So that is fantastic. What would you say to other state legislators that are going to be facing this very same question, hopefully in all 44 states that are left to do some reform?
Do not be afraid that there is not only wisdom in what you do, but hope. In this piece of legislation, and I've passed and authored 60, 70, 80 over my 9-10-year career, that have really affected people that are at or below the poverty level in my area, that are trying to encourage for us to come back economically and revitalize ourselves so that we're not watching our children leave the area, and we're watching our population start to grow again, to create educational opportunities. But there's been no one piece of legislation that I've either authored or voted for that had this much impact on this many people across the Commonwealth of Virginia. And it is one of my proudest pieces of legislation, and it will be the one thing, if they do even remember me after I'm gone, that I ask to be remembered for. I looked at your documents, 11 million license suspension throughout the United States. We are nearly 1 million of those, which means that the system that we've created for ourselves in the Commonwealth of Virginia is archaic and it must change. And so I would tell all of my Democrat and Republican friends in all the other states that this can be one of the best pieces of legislation that you can do. You can run on it, you can put it on a brochure, but quite frankly, you can feel good about yourself and know that you've made a huge difference, not only in the person's life who had their license suspended, but their children's lives. The pride that returns. And I can tell you this from testimonials of my clients after client after client who's come back, cried in my office, come back just to show me their license. how much it has changed their life. And as legislators, if we can change something legislatively that changes someone's life for the good, then that is the reason we're in government. And that's not a hard sell for my brothers and sisters, Republicans and Democrats, who are now going forth in their next legislative sessions in the year 2020. Quite frankly, it's not a partisan issue, as I've explained from the conservative side. I don't have to go into the liberal side of the argument. But it is a human issue that deserves our human touch, that deserves our recognition that everyone is given that chance in this country to be who they want to be and should not be limited by a government that overreaches into it because you have not paid its tax and then deprives you of a property right and sets you into a lower economic class because you do not obey it. That is un-American.
Our final speaker today is Andrew Warren. Andrew serves as the district attorney in the 13th Judicial Circuit in Florida. His county includes Tampa, and Tampa is one of the top most populated counties in the state outside of the Miami metro. He is uniquely positioned on this panel to be able to take some tangible steps toward making policy reforms in the area of driver's license suspension, and he has done just that since taking office in 2017. Andrew, every year, over 1.1 million Floridians receive a suspension notice because they cannot afford to pay court fines and fees. Tell us what your county in Florida looked like in regards to driving without a license suspension and charges, and when you took office, and what you decided to do about that.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation to be here today to support this campaign. I was elected on a platform of criminal justice reform. And reform encompasses a lot of different policies and practices, but at the heart of it, it's about taking a strategic, long-term approach to solve problems in the criminal justice system. And for an entire generation, if not longer, we've had such a short-sighted approach to things where crimes committed, we prosecute it, we finish the case, prosecutors pat themselves on the back for a job well done, and don't think twice about what happens after the case is closed. So one of the things that we tried to do from the time that I got into office was actually take that strategic problem-solving approach. And one of the areas where it applies most readily is in the criminalization of poverty. People who we see in the criminal justice system only because they're poor. And I'm not talking about the fictional character who steals a loaf of bread to feed a starving family. I'm talking about things much more insidious than that. Things that we watched on the videos before. Desiree's story. People who end up in the system because they are trying to do what's right, but solely because of an inability to pay, they have committed a crime that frankly most people don't even think of should be a crime in the first place. And the biggest area where that happens is driver's license suspensions for failure to pay civil fines and fees. So when I became state attorney, my office represents 1.5 million people. We handle about 70,000 cases a year. 10,000 cases a year are driving with a suspended license. I'm looking at people with their mouths open. Yes, that's the reaction I get when I'm in Florida and elsewhere talking about this. It is by far the most common case we have in our office. The majority of those cases are suspensions for failure to pay. Now, we suspend licenses for DUIs and violent crimes, but most of them are failure to pay civil fines and fees. So what we did, rather than simply prosecuting people for it, and in Florida, by the way, your first offense is a misdemeanor, your second offense is a misdemeanor, your third offense is a felony. Florida loves doing that to people. We said, rather than prosecuting people for the failure to pay the fine and fee, why don't we solve the problem and help them get their license back? So a simple change in approach to what we did led to drastic results. We went from 4% of those cases being dismissed where the driver had regained his or her license, and by the end of 2017, it was 35%. Now it's upwards of 40%. So that's 3,500 to 4,000 people a year who we are now keeping out of the system, not prosecuting them, not wasting taxpayer dollars on them, not levying all the sanctions that accompany prosecution and conviction. And by the way, they have their licenses back. And now they can be licensed, insured drivers to keep us safe on the roads, which is, of course, the purpose of the job in the first place, is to make a safer community.
So one report states that for every 1% increase in revenue from fines and fees, there is an associated 6.1% decrease in violent crime clearance rates and an 8.3% decrease in property crime clearance rates. Have you seen any pushback from law enforcement since you've changed your policies on driver's license suspension, or any impact to public safety overall?
No, I mean, this is a win-win. It's a win because we're not wasting resources prosecuting crimes that really don't threaten the safety of the community. We're not wasting taxpayer dollars on it. I said it's several thousand cases a year that prosecutors in my office can now work on more serious crimes that actually do pose a threat to the community. And we've actually received very little to zero pushback from law enforcement. We have a tremendous relationship with our law enforcement partners who recognize that the crimes that pose the greatest threat to the community are not the person who had their license suspended, who is actually driving to work to try to earn the money to pay off that suspension. And arresting that person and put them back into the system is counterproductive to public safety. It's a waste of taxpayer resources. In our office, we talk about everything we can do to build a safer, stronger, healthier community. And we've heard from people today who talking about not just the connection between the license suspension to public safety and to efficient use of taxpayer dollars, but to community health and to economic growth. So every time we suspend someone's license for a failure to pay a fine, we are undermining everything that we should be doing as a community in terms of growing our economy, having people being able to get access to education and health care for themselves and their family, and most importantly, to live a life outside the criminal justice system where they can be law-abiding, tax-paying citizens.
That's great. It sounds like your office has been taking some really positive steps in the right direction.
Only on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays.
I believe only 5% of your driving with a suspended license cases are for public safety. So your office is still having to deal with a lot in their caseload of these non-public safety related cases. Wouldn't it be better to just stop suspending the license altogether so that your office is not using its resources to even divert these issues?
The short answer is yes. I mean, there are things where, as a community, as a country, we can look at whether it actually promotes a legitimate policy interest to suspend a license. For example, a DUI case is a good example of that. But we have so many suspensions that actually don't promote traffic safety, that don't promote public safety. They're simply a punishment meant to coerce or force someone to pay off a civil debt. And what we do is make it harder for them to pay off that debt. It furthers zero public safety interest in doing it. And so what we're doing in the office by not prosecuting these cases and actually proactively helping people get their licenses back by waiving fines where we can, by waiving the administrative costs, by working with our clerk of the court to make it easier and put people on payment plans. And once they're on a payment plan, we basically stop prosecuting them. But we also need to work with our legislature to stop this tendency to, well, how do we get people to do something we want them to do? Suspend their driver's license. I mean, I'm in Tampa Bay. We have the Tampa Bay Rays, and if you're not watching, are a great team this year on a very low budget. We have a hard time getting people to go to the games, and the Rays are talking about leaving Tampa. If a legislator went, I know what we should do. We should suspend people's licenses to make them go to the games. Everyone would think that was a crazy idea. Yet we do it all the time in similar contexts where we think somehow that's going to coerce someone to do what they otherwise haven't done. And that's where the fallacy lies. That's the short-term thinking that we have to get out of when we're taking a real long-term problem-solving approach to the criminal justice system.
In just a minute, what would you say to other prosecutors who might be dealing with the same issue and what they might be able to do and the role they can play in either a coalition or local campaigns on this issue?
I'd tell them to come to Tampa to watch what we're doing, and they can catch a Rays game. I think prosecutors are starting to realize that there are different ways of doing things than the outdated way of thinking, lock them up, throw away the key, tough on crime approach, which works in certain cases. But the vast majority of cases that come through our system are not appropriate for that mentality. And if we take that problem-solving approach that I've now referred to several times, and we look at how we actually make our community safer, how we actually reduce crime in the long run, when we think about the impact of prosecution and conviction and incarceration on a person and on that person's family and on a community, and we have prosecutors think about what their mission is and how further that mission. Rather than just blindly prosecuting the cases that come in front of them, patting themselves on the back for obtaining a conviction, and then moving on to the next case, that's how we actually make a difference.
Right. Well, thank you to all my panelists for being up here today. This was a great panel discussing the different vantage points on this issue, and we really appreciate you today. Thanks.